Hi, we continue in Genesis east of Eden as we go to the famous and powerful, if short, story of Cain and Abel. And as you can see on the screen, I have only verses 1 to 5 in chapter 4 up there because that's all we're going to cover today, because there's so much going on in this classic story. It's so easy to read it superficially and not pay attention to the details. And as we've been doing this whole Radical Bible series, by exploring the details up close, we can see so much more than in stories that we think we already know. So let's jump right in and let's see how this story fits in with what we saw before with a couple of tools I've got for us here that I hope will help. For one, let's look and see how Genesis 4 fits in with the first three chapters. In the traditional scholarly understanding, Genesis 1 is a priestly text written by an author in the time of exile, expressing a view of God as Elohim, who is above and beyond, so like the creator in chapter 1, who speaks things into being from some unknown place apart from earth and heaven. In chapter 2 and 3, and here in chapter 4, where God is referred to as Yahweh, we have what is traditionally understood as a Yahweh text. Traditionally understood as from 300 years earlier, roughly, from the time of Solomon's monarchy, although in my own work I try to argue that if there's a separate J text, it's also from the time of exile. We don't need to worry about that right now, and we'll explore more of that as we go in the primeval history chapters coming up. But for now, the question is, given that tradition of Genesis 1 being written by a different author at a different time than Genesis 2, 3, and 4, it's interesting to see, I think, how the chapters now fit together so tightly, especially around the prevalence of sevens, which isn't necessarily the number 7, but words used 7 times. And sometimes you can't see that in English by counting the English words, because many translations don't translate the Hebrew word consistently. So as you can see on the left side of the screen there, in Genesis 4 alone, there are a number of things that come up 7 times. Abel 7 times, the word Ab for brother, and the word Shem for name. And then, of course, it'll be Cain's 7-fold protection and his descendant Lamech's 77-fold vengeance. And you can see below that there are the connections between Genesis 2 and through to 4, which on the traditional view would make sense because these are all by Yahweh's authors. So Eretz for earth and Sadah for field, as you can see, a number of things either individually or combined, sevens or multiples of 7. But on the second column on that left side of the divider, you see in Genesis 1 to 4, divine names, including Yahweh and Elohim, are used 70 times, 35 in Genesis 1 alone, and exactly 35 in Genesis 2, 3, and 4. And then you see more coming up in following chapters. So that certainly suggests that even if we assume different authors, somebody edited these into precise place, or perhaps the second text matched itself to the first one. It's hard to know for sure, but there we see some of that. You can also see below, and I'll scroll down so you can see this, various thematic and verbal parallels between Genesis 3 and Genesis 4, at least the first part, and 2 to 17. And so you see some of those, we'll show that more in structure in just a minute. So there's face-to-face trials, both of course, God of the man and the woman, and now God of Cain. The punishment in the form of a curse, which is then tempered. That God is responsible for the action which protects transgressors from full consequences. In the case of the first human's clothes, in the case of Cain, this protective mark, and punishment as expulsion. So the man and woman outside the garden and Cain east of Eden. There are also a number of verbal links, and we'll see more of that as we go, but the key theme of knowing, echoing the knowledge of good and evil, and here knowing as sexual knowing, and other forms as we'll see, the role of the serpent, the question of serving, and other things you can see, and we'll look at more of those as we go. On the right side, you can see the 3-part structure of Genesis 4, and note that in each of the 3 parts it begins with the man knowing his woman. So the Adam knew Eve, and Cain knew his wife, and then Adam at that point knows his wife again. So the 3 parts of the chapter fit nicely together, as well as these parallels between chapter 3 and chapter 4. And there's more to it than that. So when we looked at the beginning of the Garden of Eden story, we saw this chiasm on the left side that connects all of chapter 2 and 3 around the alternating expression of the text in narrative and in dialogue. And so you can see I've color-coded those there in a 7-part chiasm, A, B, C, D, C, B, A. On the right side, you see how that works for the first part of chapter 4, and it's not as detailed. It's A, B, C, B, A, and it's not an exact parallel, but I've spread them out so you can see how they roughly match what we see in the Garden of Eden story. So first there's a narrative, and then there's dialogue. God talking to Cain, and then Cain and Abel alone, and then God and Cain, and then God active and Cain passive. So these structures and these parallels highlight that chapter 3 and 4 are tightly connected to each other, and we're going to see a number of ways in which the one author, two authors, or multiple authors at whatever time this is all put together is showing a gradual process of moving away from the gifted state of being that God provided in the first two chapters into a gradually declining world, much more similar to how they experienced it in their time in Babylonian exile. So let's look closely at our chapter here. And as we begin just to look at this chapter and what follows in Genesis 4 to 11, we'll have many commentators who have a lot to say about that here. Here you can see in this long quote, which I'm not going to read to you here, from Hugh White, who is engaged in a lot of interpersonal discussions of Genesis, how the characters interact with each other and with God, and so he focuses a lot on that here. And I'd just like to read a little bit of this here, the first part. As creatures of desire, their actions more than their words will convey meaning, and consequently the narrator must rely more heavily than before upon third-person descriptions of their actions, as well as interpretations of their meaning. The narrator is forced to maintain the bi-leveled narrative structure with the divine and human on different planes. The narrator, who has access to both, must serve as a mediator and interpreter for the reader. So just want to read that much so we can see the role of the narrator in setting this situation up for us. And as we get to this, we're going to look at a couple of details in the Hebrew that are not visible in the English. And I want to do that right now because you can see that note in my note pane there, because of the number of times et, and I'll come to explain that in a second, appears in Genesis 4, 1-2, 5 times. The rabbis concluded that one twin sister was born with Cain, Hebrew transliteration for Cain, and two twin sisters are born with Hevel for Abel. And the GR stands for Genesis Rabbah, the ancient rabbinic commentary. JA is for Judith Antonelli, a modern feminist Jewish interpreter. So let me point that out to you so you can see exactly what we're talking about. So in Bible Hub here, you can see the et transliterated here. Et is technically an object mark, and you can see direct object mark, at least abbreviated there, which means it's recognizing when a verb is connected with a direct object. And I know you don't want to get in grammatical details, but there's something amusing and poignant about what we see here. So if I just look through the first couple of verses, you can see there's one et here, and there's another et here, and there's another one here, and there's another one here, and there's another one here. So 5 times. And yet, if we were to scroll down farther, you'd see that many direct objects don't have those. You see, as you're just scrolling randomly down to a couple other verses, you see there aren't ets like there are up here. And so one of those things is, why are there so many? And so as you see from Genesis Rabbah, they concluded a twin sister was born, and two twin sisters were born with Hevel, which is to answer the question of where did Cain's wife come from? But we'll get there long after these first 5 verses that we look at today. But that's based on what you can't see and isn't pronounced in the first verse. So we begin this way. And it's an unusual word order, as you can see in the Hebrew. It's literally, ignore, please, the provision by Bible Hub of translations, which is usually basically just taking the English translation and matching them with the word, so it's really not as accurate as what I hope I can share with you here. Really, it's, and the Adam. It's still not capital A Adam, it's the Adam, the Ha-Adam. So it's the Adam knew Eva, or Hava, his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain. And so a couple key things there. It's interesting that this is the last time that Eve is named. She was only named when he named her in the last chapter, and now she's named here, and she will not be named again anywhere else. And it's curious that Eve is never mentioned again in the whole Hebrew Bible, mentioned once in the letters of Paul as a bad example, but never mentioned again. One of the hints that this is probably a late story rather than a relatively early story if it came from the Solomonic era, which would be much before much of the later Hebrew Bible text, which with knowing it would probably refer to it. But the fact that it's not referred to later suggests it's a relatively late text. So he knew, and key here is the word yada, which we saw a few times earlier for knowledge of good and evil. But here is the first time we're seeing it for sexual knowledge, intimate knowledge, and it will be used that way a number of times throughout. It's not the only meaning for it. As you can see from Gordon Wenham's commentary quote down below, primarily, it covers knowledge acquired through the senses, experience that can be passed on to others, and practical knowledge. So that knowledge acquired through the senses includes sexual knowledge. Knowledge of intimacy of a person with whom you're naked and hopefully unashamed. And so it's one of several euphemisms for sexual intercourse in the Hebrew Scripture, and perhaps the most tender one of those. Others, which are crude, or the English translations come to things like lay with or come into or go into as cruder expressions. Just like in English, or I assume in any language, there are more polite, loving euphemisms for sex and more crude ones. And this is also expressing the poignancy of they wanted the knowledge of good and evil, and now they've got the knowledge of one another as they live outside that protected realm in Eden. So he knew his woman Eve. Again, there's no word for wife or Hebrew in wife or husband in Hebrew, ishtaf, simply woman. He knew his woman life or living, and she conceived and bore Cain. And the word pair here for conceived and bore, here har, vatahar, and she conceived, and bore here yeled, is not the word used in the curse in 3:16 that we looked at before, where Carol Myers highlighted the word heron for pregnancies. So here we see she conceived and she bore, and is skipping the entire note of pregnancy there, all within one phrase, conceived and bore Cain. And Cain represents many possible plays on words. As you can see in the notes below, this is the first creation, not explicitly named by a character. So as the Adam named all the animals, here Cain is named here by her. Cain may mean smith, as you see, but as you can see in my note, there's another word for smith, and so it can also mean to fashion or shape or give form to something, which is related to that, sort of like a craftsperson. And so we'll see how that plays out later in the chapter with the descendants of Cain. And so we find that about him, although, of course, we're going to see that that's not what he does for a living. He's a farmer. And she says, and one of the questions we have to ask is, who is she saying this to? Is the narrator giving us interior monologue, or is this a statement to her man, or is it to God, or whoever is listening to our audience? Every word is important here, because the translation you see on your screen is very misleading. I produce a man with the help of the Lord misses a part of the point here. So let's look at some of the details here. As Ilana Pardes notes, Eve's speech thus follows the formal conventions of biblical naming speeches. It links the name Cain or Cain and the verb kana to create by means of a pun. And so she's created, so that really works better here than produced, but can also mean acquired. And that's part of the issue here. So you see there's many examples of how that verb is used to gain things like fields, which plainly is not produced or created, but acquired. And you see other examples of that there. So is it acquired, produced, created? And here it's an ish. So the Adam knew his ishtav, and she produced an ish with Yahweh. And that's why I really want you to see this here on the screen, that there is no word for help in the Hebrew. You can see that here, with Yahweh, et Yahweh here, and et can mean with, but it certainly doesn't mean help. And this notion that the woman and Yahweh combined to produce a child was disturbing to later writers who were grounded in Platonic philosophy and found this violative of their understanding of things, including the Jewish writer Philo, who was so influential on generating a Christianity grounded much more in Platonism than in the Hebrew Bible. Not because he was a Christian, but because later Christian writers used his foundations to generate their Christian theology. So he says here an objection about this sentence. And therefore we must make our protest against the mind, which thought the offspring engendered by union with sense his own possession, called it Cain, and said, I have gotten a man through God. Even in these last two words he erred. You ask how? Because God is the cause, not the instrument, and that which comes into being is brought into being, not into being through an instrument by a cause. And he says further, was it correctly said about Cain, I have acquired a man through God? A distinction is made between by someone or from someone, and through something or from something, that is from matter. I'll stop it there, but what you can hear is that Philo is insisting that his presuppositions trump the text. And the reason I want to highlight that is, although we could be amused by how wild and misreading it is and how forced he tries to make the text fit his Platonic presuppositions about the badness, or at least the irrelevance of the material world, it shows the influence of bad readings early on this text, and why it's so important to look at the details in its original cultural context, so we can see that it's not in any way against God's involvement with human being here. So We could also we'll also hear more from Philo and from Josephus about how they object to some of these things as we go. So she's the first co-creator here, and it's an interesting thing because the question of who's been co-created in the early rabbinical interpretations, it was understood that she'd created Adam. That it came out of her. After all, the two were created together, and the first Ish came to be with her. So it could be either as Adam, which is an early interpretation, or of course the obvious alternative here is that it's Cain. So much for the first verse here. So then next she bore his brother Abel, and again, as the rabbis like to say, as you can see in my note from Genesis Rabbah down below, and she again bore implies an additional birth, but not an additional pregnancy. So is it just one came out and then the other came out? Are they twins, like Jacob and Esau that we'll see later? The word for next, as you can see in my note, Yesef, means and she added, which is the name Joseph, which we'll see what happens later, much later, when Joseph is added to the children of Jacob. So next she bore his brother Abel. And a note that we have to pay attention to here, again from von Wolde down below, is Hevel is always called Cain's brother, but Cain is never called Hevel's brother. Cain has a brother, but is not himself a brother. And the one he's a brother to is named Abel, suggesting steam or vapor or vanity in the classic interpretation from the book of Ecclesiastes, where it's usually rendered vanity of vanities, but can also mean steam or just something that isn't around for long, as Van Wolde notes down below. Who gives a child that kind of name? And of course the only answer here is the narrator. In other places we can see in the Bible it's used not just as the name, but it corresponds to something that's transitory. And you'll also see down my note below the naming pattern in these verses. So Abel, Abel, Cain, Cain, Abel, Abel, and then Cain, Cain. You can see that, as I note down there below, that the ordinary form of the word is 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes out of 81, so almost half in the entire Hebrew Bible are there. So that's where it's most familiar from, as vanity. But here the issue isn't that Abel is vain. The issue is that he's insubstantial. He has no speaking part. We're only going to know a brief thing about him, and then he's gone from the text and from the world. And so after Cain and Abel are born, now we find out what they do for a living. No concern with their childhood, no concern with what they look like, no concern with what their relationship is, no concern with why they're choosing these ways of being. And of course, they're the first people to have a way of being. Adam and Eve have no vocation. We're not told they do any work, despite the curse that would sentence Adam to fighting with the earth for food. We don't ever hear him doing that. And everything about these next verses is incredibly mysterious. And that's why I want to take a lot of time to look through some of the details here, and that's why we're only going to do a few verses. So he's a keeper of sheep, a roetzon, and that's equivalent to be a shepherd. And shepherds, of course, are throughout the Hebrew Bible, including God as a shepherd. And Cain is a tiller of the ground, and Oved Adamah here, a farmer. Doing what the sentence is, and doing, depending upon how we translated it, the vocation to which humans were, of which there was none yet when God first made them in the garden. But it doesn't take our modern reading here of the curse as anti-agriculture and questioning civilization, as we'll see later in this chapter when Cain becomes the first city builder, to note that down below you see in Genesis Rabbah, the rabbis already recognize this. They say, 3 had a passion for agriculture, and no good was found in them: Cain, Noah, and Uzziah. Cain was a tiller of the ground, Noah the husbandman, and Uzziah. Cain became a murderer, Noah a drunkard, and Uzziah a leper. So already, without necessarily having the full same understanding that we're going to unfold here from modern understandings, the rabbis got that there was something suspicious about him as a tiller of the ground. But there's so much more to be paying attention to here. Philo takes this as an expression of Cain's interest in, quote, earthly and inanimate things. Josephus, the first century historian, who's not as much of a Platonist as Philo, but he goes further and says, as you can see here, Cain, on the contrary, was thoroughly depraved and had an eye only to gain. He was the first brother to think of plowing the soil, and he slew his brother for the following reasons. The brothers having decided to sacrifice to God, Cain brought fruits of the tilled earth and of the trees. Abel came with milk and the firstlings of his flock. This was the offering which found more favor with God, who was honored by things that grow spontaneously and in accordance with natural laws, and not by the products forced from nature by the ingenuity of grasping man. Now, Josephus, like so many commentators, is just making so much of that up. We don't know those details about Cain bringing from the trees or Abel coming with milk. But his conclusion there that God is honored more by things that grow spontaneously and not by the products forced from nature certainly also fits the interpretation we're working on here, and we'll see more of that as we go. So coming to the middle here, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering from the fruit of the ground. And why? Where? What? You can see from this classic image from the Ghent altar, one of countless portrayals of these offerings. But as you can see there, who is it being offered to and why? If we look at the very beginning of the book of Leviticus, which may well have been written around the same time as Genesis, we see the very first verses of Leviticus are about the proper means of giving a sacrifice from your flock. So we hear this. Yahweh summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, When any of you bring an offering of livestock to Yahweh, you shall bring your offering from the herd or from the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you shall offer a male without blemish. You shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance in your behalf before Yahweh. But there is no tent of meeting here. There is no temple. There is no altar. There is no anything. And so when it says Cain brought to Yahweh, we have to ask where? If we were making the movie of this, how would we portray this? Did he just hold it up to the sky? What do we understand the relationship with Yahweh is at this point? And the specific verb here, is used for the offering of sacrifice, making that link with Leviticus 2 as well as with chapter 1 that we just saw. And it's described as an offering, or minha, a gift, something we'll see later in the Jacob cycle as a gift of the fruit of the ground, Mapri Hag Adamah. There's no connection made here with what we saw in the curse, that there'd be suffering and pain to get it there. And there's nothing, despite many commentators wanting to read into it, about its poor quality or its a small amount. There's no description made at all. Abel, for his part, or literally, moreover, he too brought of the firstlings. And if I scroll down here, so you can see here, where we see that, you could see firstborn here, Midbakora, and that will be also something that plays out in the Jacob story. So a number of things that will anticipate the Jacob and Esau relationship. So from the firstborn of his flock, which is ironic because here Yahweh accepts the firstborn, but throughout the generations in Genesis, we'll see the firstborn are often rejected in favor of later ones. Maybe that has something to do with Israel and Judah, as we'll see later. The firstborn, they're fat portions here, and you see the word Helev here is a word play on Hevel, so it's the same consonant. It's in a different order. So Hevel brought Helev. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering, or as we see here, gazed upon. And it's 15 times in Hebrew scripture, but only here in the next verse, this verb for gaze upon. So it's a looking that makes it happen. Had regard is too abstract because it doesn't explain how it happens. But even here, we don't know how it happens. How do they know it happens? How do Cain and Abel know that Yahweh looked upon Abel's offering, his gift, but did not look upon Cain's? There's nothing described here about how they brought it or how they know this. That's obviously not the concern of the text. But as White says down below, the first vital act of communication between God and man after the expulsion from paradise is thus accomplished with the medium of sight rather than language. So it had regard for Abel and his offering. And again, that's just highlighting what I just said here. And here, Minha again, to connect those together. And then we see, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. And this leads to countless arguments by scholars. I'm just going to scroll through some of this. In fact, I'm going to move this up so we can see it more. And even though it will make the video a little longer, this is just the turning point in the whole situation here. So Antonelli notes, Hevel's animal offering is acceptable to God because it was the choicest of the firstborn of the flock. Cain's plant offering was neither his first nor his choicest, and God rejected it. But of course, the text says nothing about that. Going down to Klaus Westermann here, who follows that same point I'm making, that there's no evidence of that. He highlights that the text doesn't say it has anything to do with the quality of Cain's sacrifice or Cain's attitude. As he says, it says saying something about the immutable. It just happened so. Going down a little further, he says, Cain's reaction is normal and justified. Without reason, he is disadvantaged and rejected. One must be clear that the narrator is not thinking of an individual or in terms of individual ethic, but is concerned with human existence in common. And here from One of my great mentors and one of our great scholars, Walter Brueggemann, conventional interpretation is too hard on Cain and too easy on Yahweh. Essential to the plot is the capricious freedom of Yahweh. Like the narrator, we must resist every effort to explain it. There is nothing here of Yahweh preferring cowboys to farmers. The rejection of Cain is not reasoned. Life is unfair. God is free. And that's highlighting a major theme that Brueggemann has throughout many of his many books of the freedom of God to not be controlled by human beings. Similarly, Nahum Sarna, an esteemed, now late Hebrew Bible scholar, in general a Jewish scholar, says that the interpretation that this is reflecting the traditional rivalry between the nomad and the farmer is untenable. And so many people reject that. And I could go through more and more of those, but I won't for the sake of time. My own view, for whatever it's worth, is I think it does have something to do with shepherds and farmers. I'm not going to try to go through that now, but I'll work that through as we go. So let's just finish our verse before this goes on for too long. So for Cain's offering, he did not look. And so Cain here was angry and his face fell. And as White notes below, it is significant that the narrator, who is so restrained in his description of the outer appearance of his characters, has in both these cases provided such a description of his face. And the face, here described as countenance, is going to be a key word throughout Genesis, as it was already where in the very beginning God's Spirit hovered over the face of the deep. This is the first anger we hear, and anger enters after a fear after fear. And we could literally describe that, as you see in the parallels from Ezekiel and the Psalms, as Cain was burnt up and his face fell. So that's where we will end today in this first scene, with an angry Cain, a fallen face, and the question of how to respond to this disappointing experience. See you next time.